Hi everyone, welcome to the I Am Knower channel. This time, I will tell you a story about Hannibal Barca, Scourge of Rome. Find the most comfortable position for you right now. You can sit in a chair with your back straight, but still relaxed, or lie down comfortably. If you like this video, please push like button and subscribe this channel. Chapter 1, Son of Carthage. The sky above Carthage burned with the bitterness of defeat. Smoke twisted in lazy columns from the harbor where warships, once the pride of the Carthaginian fleet, lay splintered and charred. It was to 41 BCE, and the First Punic War had ended not with glory, but with humiliation. For nearly 2 decades, Carthage and Rome had fought for dominance of the Mediterranean. Now, after a war of attrition waged on sea and land, Carthage, wealthy, proud, and powerful, had been brought low. Among the crowds gathering along the Phoenician-styled streets, one boy stood silently beside his father. He was no older than 9, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had already seen the fate of empires. His name was Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar Barca, the famed Carthaginian general who had led daring campaigns in Sicily before the Senate called him home. On that day, Hamilcar looked to his son with the same solemnity he gave his soldiers. And then, by legend or oath, he asked something of the boy that would shape the course of history. Swear to me that you will never be a friend to Rome, the bloodline of fire and war. Hannibal's lineage was steeped in war. His family, the Barcids, were part of Carthage's elite military and political class. Carthage itself was no minor city. It was one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the ancient world, founded by Phoenician traders and fortified by centuries of seafaring dominance. But Carthage had a problem: Rome. And Rome had discovered its own hunger for empire. The First Punic War had shown Carthage what Rome was capable of. While Carthage had focused on naval warfare, Rome had reinvented itself as a naval power virtually from scratch. It built ships en masse, trained and experienced sailors through sheer discipline, and endured losses that would have broken lesser republics. Now, Rome demanded tribute. It demanded territory. It demanded submission. For a man like Hamilcar, that was unbearable, and so he turned his gaze across the sea, to the lands of Hispania, modern-day Spain. There, he saw a new opportunity for Carthaginian strength, wealth, and revenge. A childhood forged in campaigns, Hannibal did not grow up in comfort. From a young age, he accompanied his father on military expeditions. When Hamilcar began his conquest of Hispania round to 37 BCE, Hannibal went with him, absorbing the chaos of war like it was language. Unlike the pampered sons of Carthaginian merchants, Hannibal learned strategy by watching the movements of Iberian tribes. He saw diplomacy unfold in blood and silver. He understood how alliances were made through marriage, battle, or betrayal. By the time he was a teenager, he was speaking multiple languages and commanding the respect of hardened soldiers. Carthage might have signed peace with Rome, but in Hannibal's heart, the war had never ended. His father died in battle around to 28 BCE, swept away by a river while fighting rebellious tribes. The torch passed briefly to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who governed Carthaginian Iberia diplomatically. But when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army turned to Hannibal. He was just 25. The oath remembered. As general of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia, Hannibal acted swiftly. He expanded territory, secured alliances, and rebuilt an army not of Carthaginians alone, but a mosaic of cultures: Libyans, Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, and more. They didn't fight for Carthage alone. They fought for Hannibal. But expansion brought him into contact with Saguntum, a city allied with Rome. Hannibal claimed Saguntum had violated regional treaties. Rome claimed Hannibal had crossed a line. He laid siege to the city anyway. After months of brutal combat, Saguntum fell. Thousands died. Rome sent envoys to Carthage, demanding Hannibal be turned over for violating the peace. Carthage replied, "Let Rome seek him on the battlefield." The Second Punic War had begun. Chapter 2, General at the Gates. The sun rose over the hills of Carthago Nova, Carthage's Iberian stronghold, bathing its stone walls and shimmering harbor in gold. But within its military camps, There was no calm. Drums beat a steady rhythm. Horses stamped impatiently. The clang of weapons being tested and sharpened echoed through the morning air. Orders were barked in multiple tongues: Iberian, Punic, Numidian, yet all heads turned to a single man when he passed through the ranks. Hannibal Barca, commander of the Carthaginian forces in Hispania, had declared war on Rome, and now he was preparing to strike it at its very heart, a war without permission. When Hannibal sacked Saguntum in 19 BCE, Rome considered it a direct act of war. Hannibal knew this would be the result. His siege had been more than a military maneuver, it was a message. He was done waiting for Carthage's cautious Senate to decide its destiny. The Roman Republic, meanwhile, was not yet ready. It underestimated the Carthaginian general and expected a naval assault. Instead, Hannibal conceived one of the most daring campaigns in history. He would lead his army overland, across the treacherous Pyrenees, the Rhine River, and finally the snow-choked Alps, directly into Italy. It was a move so bold that Rome didn't believe it possible. That was exactly why it would work. Building an army of nations. Hannibal's force was unlike any single army Rome had ever faced. It was a coalition of mercenaries, allies, and loyal troops, handpicked and trained with discipline and respect. Iberian warriors, fierce and swift, carried curved swords and unmatched stamina. Numidian cavalry, masters of mobility, could scatter and regroup faster than Roman scouts could track them. Libyan infantry, drilled in Carthaginian formations, held the line like seasoned phalanxes. And then there were the war elephants, symbols of power and terror that struck fear into Roman hearts. Long before battle even began, this army, roughly 50,000 strong, moved north toward the Rhine River. It would be whittled down by hardship, betrayal, and terrain. But what remained would be hardened, loyal, and impossibly lethal. Crossing the Rhine, Rome had spies. It knew Hannibal was on the move. But even then, it could hardly believe the route he was taking. As he approached the Rhine, Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had already dispatched a force to intercept him. Hannibal, aware of every Roman movement through his network of scouts and tribal alliances, sent a detachment upstream under cover of night to outflank the Romans. By dawn, they were across the river. The Romans, caught off guard, withdrew. They assumed Hannibal would now turn south, march toward Massalia, modern-day Marseille, and fight in Gaul. Instead, Hannibal turned east toward the towering Alps. His officers protested. His allies doubted. Even his men, hardened from years of war, looked toward the jagged peaks with dread. Hannibal's reply was simple: I will find a way, or I will make one. The march into the mountains, the crossing of the Alps in late 18 BCE, is one of the most extraordinary feats in military history. It was not just a march, it was a struggle against death itself. Avalanches buried men alive. Hostile Gallic tribes ambushed the column, attacking from cliffs and forests. Elephants slipped and fell to their deaths on narrow paths. Food was scarce, and the freezing wind cracked skin and split hooves. For nearly 2 weeks, Hannibal's army crawled through snow and stone. What had started as 50,000 troops arrived in Italy as a force of barely 26,000. Yet those who remained had achieved the impossible, and they were ready to follow their general into hell. And that's where they were headed, into the Italian peninsula, the heartland of Rome, unguarded and vulnerable. Panic in Rome. When word reached the Senate that Hannibal had crossed the Alps, fear gripped the Republic. No Carthaginian army had ever stepped foot on Roman soil since the days of the Etruscans. Now, a seasoned commander with a multinational army stood at their doorstep, with no fortifications between him and the Tiber. The Senate dispatched every available legion to stop him. But Hannibal didn't plan to march on Rome, not yet. Instead, he would begin a systematic campaign of destruction, luring Roman armies into the open. His strategy was brilliant: provoke Rome, destroy its legions one by one, and encourage its allies to rebel. He would bleed the Republic from within. Rome didn't yet realize they weren't fighting a general, they were fighting a phenomenon. Chapter 3. Crossing the Alps, the wind screamed down the icy slopes like a living thing, sharp, merciless, and unrelenting. It tore through leather armor, froze the breath in lungs, and turned even the strongest war beasts into trembling shadows. Of themselves, beneath the jagged peaks of the Alps, Hannibal Barca stood at the edge of the known world, preparing to drag an army not around the mountains, but through them. Few Roman commanders could imagine it. Even fewer believed it was possible. But Hannibal was not a man restrained by what others believed possible. The root of madness. By autumn of 218 BCE, Hannibal had already outmaneuvered a Roman army along the Rhine River. His next move shocked the ancient world. He would cross the Alps before winter and strike at Rome from the north. From where they least expected, there was no single Alpine crossing. The Alps stretch over 750 miles, and Hannibal's exact route is still debated by historians today. Some argue for the Colonel de la Traversette, others for the Little St. Bernard Pass. Regardless of the path, one thing is universally agreed upon: it was one of the most dangerous routes a military force could ever take. And yet, Hannibal chose it not in spite of the danger, but because of it. Hostile tribes and betrayals. The journey began in what is now southeastern France. At first, Gallic tribes offered peace, even guides and supplies, but trust was a luxury Hannibal could not afford. One night, under cover of darkness, the friendly tribes struck his column in a narrow pass. Hundreds were killed or trampled, wagons were overturned, and elephants panicked, crushing both enemies and allies alike. Hannibal responded with calculated fury. He regrouped, counterattacked, and left their mountain homes burning behind him. The message was clear: the Alps may break us, but no man will. The toll of the mountains. The higher they climbed, the more brutal the terrain became. Soldiers slipped to their deaths. Rocks shattered beneath marching feet, exposing sheer drops. Ice storms blinded visibility. Pack animals tumbled into ravines. Supply wagons were abandoned, and men were forced to carry provisions on their backs. At one point, Hannibal's path was blocked by a recent landslide. The cliff had collapsed into a gorge, leaving no way forward. For most generals, this would be the end. Hannibal ordered fires lit against the stone. Once it cracked, his engineers poured vinegar onto the heated rock, an ancient technique to weaken the structure. They shattered a path wide enough to rebuild the pass. Each day brought more death. From over 50,000 men, Hannibal lost nearly half his army during the crossing. He lost thousands of horses, most of his supply animals, and all but a few of his 37 war elephants. Yet what emerged from the Alps in November was not a defeated army. It was a hardened spearpoint aimed straight at Rome's heart. The view from the summit. There's a tale, possibly legend, that as Hannibal's army reached the crest of the Alps, he brought his men to a ledge and pointed to the valley below. "You are treading on the walls of Italy," he told them. "Now you are not merely going to fight for a province, but for the capital of Rome itself." They could see the green fields of the Po Valley, Roman territory, ripe for conquest. For many of these men, Numidians from North Africa, Gauls from the west, Iberians from Spain, it was the first time they glimpsed the fabled land they had marched to destroy. Behind them, loss, exhaustion, and the dead. Ahead, revenge. The Romans were waiting, but not ready. Rome had assumed Hannibal would attack by sea. When word spread that he had crossed the Alps, panic once again gripped the Senate. They had never planned for the scenario. An enemy on Roman soil was a nightmare, especially one they could not predict. 2 legions under Publius Scipio were rushed north. They would soon meet Hannibal's worn army at the Battle of the Ticinus River, where Rome would learn that even a tired Hannibal was a lethal Hannibal. The campaign begins. Italy had never been invaded like this. Hannibal didn't just plan to fight Roman armies, he planned to unravel Rome itself. He sought to break its alliances, destroy its legions, and expose the Republic's fragile unity. His campaign in Italy would become a case study in strategy, shock, and psychological warfare. Rome would send army after army to stop him, and one by one, he would annihilate them. But it began here, with frozen feet, hollow stomachs, and bleeding hands, crossing the Alps not just to fight a war, but to change history. Chapter 4. The Genius of Cannae. The fields of Cannae were flat, wide, and open, perfect for a Roman army trained to move in disciplined formations, shoulder to shoulder, in overwhelming numbers. It was August of 216 BCE, and the Roman Republic had assembled its largest force ever fielded, nearly 90,000 soldiers, including legions, cavalry, and auxiliaries. The Senate, enraged and terrified by Hannibal's successive victories, was determined to end him once and for all. But Hannibal Barca wasn't preparing to run. He was preparing to make history. Rome's war machine, after humiliating defeats at the Ticinus, Trebia, and Lake Trasimene, Rome was no longer underestimating Hannibal. They believed they now understood his tactics. This time, they would crush him with sheer force. 2 consuls led the Roman army, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, each commanding on alternating days. Varro was brash and overconfident. Paulus was cautious but constrained by tradition. Rome's plan was simple: use its massive infantry to smash Hannibal's center and break his line. With numbers nearly double that of Hannibal's 50,000 troops, it should have worked. But Hannibal wasn't just fighting a battle. He was orchestrating a masterpiece. Setting the stage, Hannibal chose Cannae deliberately. The open plain was perfect for cavalry maneuvers, his key advantage. He arranged his forces in a crescent formation, with his weaker infantry in the center and his strongest African veterans on the flanks. His cavalry, including the fierce Numidian horsemen, flanked both sides. To the Romans, it looked like the Carthaginian center was vulnerable. That was exactly what Hannibal wanted them to think. The battle begins. At dawn, under a red and dust-choked sky, the 2 armies clashed. The Roman infantry, shoulder to shoulder in dense formations, surged forward. They pushed directly into Hannibal's center. Just as planned, the Carthaginian line gave way. But this was not collapse, it was choreography. Step by step, Hannibal's center pulled back, absorbing the Roman assault and drawing them in deeper, narrowing their front. To the Romans, it looked like they were winning. In truth, they were walking into a trap, the double envelopment. As the Roman formation compressed inward, Hannibal's veteran infantry on the flanks, who had been holding their ground, curved inward, like closing jaws. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen, circled around to attack from behind. Within moments, the Romans were completely surrounded. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The aftermath of the nearly 90,000 Roman troops who entered the field. That day, more than 50,000 were killed, including Consul Paulus, over 80 senators, and dozens of military tribunes. It was the deadliest single day in Roman military history. Carthaginian losses were minimal by comparison, only around 5,000 dead. Hannibal had executed the first recorded instance of a full double envelopment maneuver, still taught in military academies today. It was tactical perfection, flawless in planning, timing, and execution. The news sent shockwaves through the Republic. There was open panic in Rome. Entire cities considered defecting to Carthage. Hannibal had the momentum, the advantage, and the moral upper hand. But then, he did not march on Rome. Why didn't Hannibal take the city? The question has haunted historians for centuries. Why? After his greatest victory, didn't Hannibal finish the war by marching on Rome itself? The truth is complex. His army, while victorious, was exhausted and depleted. He lacked siege equipment and local supplies. Rome still had reserves and could retreat behind walls. Most importantly, Hannibal expected Rome to sue for peace. Many within the Senate considered it, but Rome was not like other nations. Instead, Rome reorganized, shifted its strategy, and made a fateful decision: never again to meet Hannibal in open battle. Hannibal's finest hour. Though he didn't destroy Rome outright, Cannae marked the zenith of Hannibal's power. Allies flocked to him. Southern Italian cities revolted. Carthage's enemies quaked. But the war was not over. It was entering a new phase, one of siege, attrition, and politics, and Rome, humiliated and bloodied, was beginning to adapt. They had lost the battle, but they had not yet lost the war. Chapter 5. The Shadow over Rome. The blood-soaked fields of Cannae had barely dried before the question spread like fire. Why wasn't Hannibal at the gates of Rome? From the smoke-filled ruins of their army, the Roman Senate braced for the final blow. But it never came. Rome was wounded deeply but not dead. And as the months passed and no siege arrived, a cold realization set in. Hannibal had won battles, but not the war. Rome's stubborn soul. After Cannae, most nations would have surrendered. Rome did the opposite. They refused peace negotiations. They mobilized fresh legions, recruiting even slaves and criminals to fill the ranks. They executed generals who had fled the battlefield, showing the Republic would tolerate no weakness. They passed a law that banned mourning for the dead in an effort to suppress despair and deny Hannibal the satisfaction of Roman grief. Fabius Maximus, known as Cunctator the Delayer, began to shape Rome's response. His strategy: avoid battle, harass Hannibal's supply lines, and slowly bleed him dry. It was the beginning of a war of attrition, and it played to Rome's greatest strength, not brilliance, but endurance. Hannibal's Italian campaign. While Hannibal didn't march on Rome itself, he wasn't idle. For over a decade, he rampaged through Italy like a ghost. He occupied key cities like Capua, once Rome's ally. He courted rebellion among Italian states, especially in the south. He continued to win smaller engagements, setting ambushes and sowing terror. But as the years dragged on, one problem became clear. Hannibal was alone. Carthage's leadership, cautious and divided, refused to fully support him. Reinforcements were scarce. Supply lines were unreliable. The great general who had once crossed the Alps with elephants and fire now found himself a warlord trapped in hostile territory, a map of growing isolation. Though his army remained undefeated in open battle, Hannibal's situation worsened. Many cities feared Roman retaliation and stayed loyal to the Republic. Fabius's tactics ensured Hannibal could never rest. Scipio Africanus, a new Roman leader rising from the ashes of Cannae, began attacking Carthage's holdings in Iberia, threatening Hannibal's base of power. Rome began to turn the tide not through confrontation, but through containment. Psychological warfare. Hannibal's presence became as much psychological as military. Parents frightened children with his name, Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. He lived in the minds of Romans, but not in their streets. Each year he stayed in Italy. The Carthaginian dream of breaking Rome faded just a little more. He had crossed mountains, slaughtered legions, and shaken the very pillars of the Republic. But the final blow always eluded him. And then, Rome did something Hannibal couldn't ignore. They brought the war to Carthage. The call back home. In 204 BCE, Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio landed in North Africa. His target, Carthage itself. Panic gripped the city. Now it was their gates that trembled. The Senate in Carthage, realizing that the war had come full circle, sent word to Hannibal, return. After 15 years in Italy, after decades of campaign and conquest, Hannibal turned his face homeward. His army, reduced and weathered, followed him south. He would face Scipio in a final confrontation. The war isn't over yet. Hannibal had haunted Rome for over a decade. He had destroyed its armies, scarred its soul, and reshaped the ancient world's understanding of warfare. But now, Rome was ascendant. The final chapter of the war would be written not on Roman soil, but on the African plains. It would pit the two greatest minds of their age against one another. It would be Hannibal's last great chance to turn the tide. Chapter 6. The Rise of Scipio. He was just 17 when Hannibal crossed the Alps. He stood amid the slaughter at Cannae, barely escaping with his life. He lost his father and uncle in battles against Hannibal's armies. And yet, Publius Cornelius, Scipio, the man who would be called Africanus, did not falter. He watched. He listened. He learned. Rome had suffered humiliation, but in its ashes, a different kind of Roman leader was rising, one forged not in the Senate halls, but in the fires of defeat. A republic in crisis. After Cannae, Rome was desperate for stability. Entire regions defected. Morale plummeted. Veterans died faster than they could be replaced. Even the gods seemed silent. But young Scipio stood out. During the chaos after Cannae, he famously drew his sword in front of panicked survivors and swore he would never abandon the Republic. Those around him followed suit. He had courage, but more than that, he had vision. Scipio didn't just want to fight Hannibal, he wanted to be better than him. Turning the tide in Iberia. By his mid-20s, Scipio was granted command in Hispania, where Carthage still held valuable territory. Many Roman senators opposed the decision. It was unprecedented to give so much power to someone so young. But Scipio didn't waste time. He captured Carthago Nova, Hannibal's Iberian capital. In a surprise attack, he broke Carthage's alliances with local tribes through diplomacy and speed. He studied Hannibal's battle tactics and began adapting them for Roman use. By 106 BCE, Carthage had lost Spain, a crippling blow to its empire and its resources. Scipio had done what no other Roman general could: take the fight to the Barcids and win. Rome had found its answer to Hannibal. Preparing for Africa, Scipio returned to Rome in triumph. The Senate, still weary from years of war, was cautious, but Scipio was persuasive. His plan was bold: invade Africa, force Carthage to recall Hannibal, and end the war on Carthaginian soil. Rome approved. Barely. In 200 for BCE, Scipio crossed the Mediterranean with a fresh Roman army. He formed alliances with the Numidians, who had once fought beside Hannibal. Now, their cavalry would fight against him. Hannibal was finally summoned home. The duel is set. Back in Carthage, after 15 years abroad, Hannibal was no longer a symbol of invincibility. He was a veteran of a long, draining war. His enemies in the Carthaginian Senate blamed him for Rome's retaliation. His army, though still feared, lacked the strength and numbers it once had. Scipio offered him peace on terms that would reduce Carthage to a client state. Hannibal refused. Their confrontation was inevitable. It would take place near the village of Zama, southwest of Carthage, in 100 BCE. Unlike every battle before it, Hannibal would be outmatched in both cavalry and morale. Rome had changed. Its general meaning had changed. And now, the man who had once terrorized the Republic would face a commander who had studied him like a book and who was prepared to close it. Chapter 7. Zama, the fall of the lion. The plains near Zama, dry and vast, shimmered under the North African sun. Dust swirled in the wind. Kicked up by tens of thousands of feet, across the field, two armies stared one another down. In one camp, Hannibal Barca, the aging lion of Carthage, undefeated on Roman soil for nearly 2 decades. In the other, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the rising star of Rome, patient, sharp, and molded in Hannibal's image. The world had never seen such a duel. This wasn't just a battle between generals, it was a reckoning. Who would shape the future of the ancient world? The armies. Hannibal's force was a shadow of his Italian army, still large, but filled with inexperienced recruits, a handful of seasoned veterans, and about 80 war elephants. His cavalry was weakened, and his Numidian allies had switched sides to Rome. Scipio's army, though smaller in infantry, was better disciplined, highly mobile, and backed by elite Numidian cavalry. Under Massinissa, former ally of Hannibal, this time, Hannibal was the one at a disadvantage, and he knew it. Before the battle, the two men met privately, one of the most remarkable encounters in history. Hannibal offered peace. Scipio demanded full Carthaginian surrender. Neither would bend. The war would end not with words, but with steel. The battle begins. At dawn, Hannibal unleashed his elephants, dozens of them, hoping to crush the Roman lines with terror and chaos. But Scipio had planned for this. Roman soldiers opened lanes, blowing horns and rattling spears to disorient the beasts. Many elephants turned back, trampling Hannibal's own front lines. Scipio's Numidian cavalry, once Hannibal's greatest weapon, now countered the Carthaginian horsemen and drove them off the flanks. The first charge had failed. Infantry clash. Next came the infantry. Hannibal's first 2 lines, mercenaries and raw recruits, clashed with the Roman legions. It was brutal, grinding combat. Hannibal hoped to wear down the Romans before deploying his veterans, the same men who had once crushed Rome at Cannae. But Scipio again anticipated him. He withdrew his front lines, allowing them to rest and reform. Behind the fresh second line, the Roman forces absorbed the charge and then pushed forward with renewed strength. The final moment came when the Numidian cavalry, having chased the Carthaginians from the field, circled back and struck Hannibal's rear. Just as Hannibal had once done at Cannae. The end of the battle. Encircled, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, Hannibal's army broke. He fought to the last, directing troops, encouraging his men, even leading small countercharges. But the tide had turned. What he had once inflicted on Rome had now been turned against him. Carthage was defeated. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had won. Aftermath, peace and punishment. Carthage sued for peace. Scipio now hailed as Africanus dictated brutal terms. Carthage was forced to disarm. They lost their overseas empire. They were forbidden to wage war without Roman permission. They had to pay an enormous indemnity for 50 years. Carthage, once master of the seas, became a crippled city-state. Hannibal, broken but alive, returned to Carthage in disgrace. A warrior in exile, in the years after Zama, Hannibal became a statesman, reforming Carthaginian politics and rooting out corruption. But Rome never forgot him. They demanded his exile. He fled east, becoming a wandering advisor to foreign kings, still scheming against Rome from the shadows. Eventually, with Roman agents closing in, Hannibal took poison rather than be captured. His final words, as recorded by legend, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Zama in history. Zama was not just the end of Hannibal. It was the dawn of Roman dominance. Scipio Africanus would go down in history as the man who defeated the undefeatable. Rome would soon turn its sights to Greece, Asia, and eventually all of Europe. But even in defeat, Hannibal's name endured. The Romans built an empire. Hannibal built a legend. Chapter 8. The man behind the myth. When Roman children misbehaved, parents would whisper his name like a ghost story. Hannibal ad Portus. Hannibal is at the gates. He was afraid. He was brilliant. He was the enemy who had come closer to destroying Rome than anyone before or since. But behind the legend was a man born not to rule, but to avenge. A boy who swore an oath at his father's knee and never broke it. The mind of a strategist. Even his enemies admitted it. Hannibal was a genius. His ability to read terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and manipulate both armies and emotions made him one of the most innovative tacticians. In military history, he was flexible, never relying on one style of battle. He was psychologically precise, baiting Rome into traps again and again. He was charismatic, able to lead Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Carthaginians, men who shared no language or culture through years of brutal campaigning. His masterpiece, the Battle of Cannae, is still studied at West Point, Sandhurst, and military academies worldwide. Even Scipio Africanus, his greatest adversary, respected him so deeply that he adopted many of Hannibal's methods, flawed but human. But Hannibal was not infallible. He underestimated Rome's will to endure. He lacked the political support from Carthage to fully capitalize on his victories. He was a military genius, yes, but he was no empire builder. He also refused cruelty for its own sake. Unlike many conquerors, Hannibal rarely committed massacres. He offered fair terms to defeated cities. He spared Roman prisoners. He was not driven by conquest alone, but by a sense of duty, revenge, and a vision of Carthaginian strength. In a brutal age, Hannibal stood apart, not soft, but principled. Legacy and influence. Though he lost the war, Hannibal won something more enduring: immortality. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Ferdinand Foch, WWI commander, said, "Hannibal taught us the art of war." George S. Patton called Cannae a perfect model of encirclement. Even Rome, after destroying Carthage a generation later, respected him enough to keep his name alive in their records. Plutarch, Livy, and Polybius wrote of him not as a monster but as a worthy foe. And in Carthage, for centuries after its fall, Hannibal's name lived on in secret, in whispers, in the stories of merchants and soldiers who remembered the man who almost brought Rome to its knees. What if, had Hannibal received more support? Had he marched on Rome after Cannae? Had Carthage stood united behind him? Would the world today speak Latin or Punic? History cannot be rewritten, but Hannibal Barca remains one of the great what-ifs, a reminder that brilliance, courage, and clarity of purpose are not always enough to change the course of nations, but they're enough to change the way we understand them. Conclusion. The scourge and the symbol. In the end, Hannibal was more than a general. He was a symbol of resistance, of brilliance, of destiny defied. He didn't build a lasting empire. He didn't die on a throne, but his life carved itself into the memory of civilizations. And as long as war is studied, and courage admired, and boldness honored, Hannibal Barca will never be forgotten.